Now we're going to talk about presentations. As a PM, you will need to be constantly communicating. Presentations are a great tool that you can use to share your ideas. But before we get into the details, one of the most important things to keep in mind when creating a presentation is to keep it simple. Don't try to cover everything. Just focus on getting your key points and messages across. So now let's talk a little bit about the right structure for your presentation. There's three main parts. There's an introduction. This is what I'm going to tell you. And in this section, you want to provide any background information or context that will be helpful for the audience to understand your presentation. You also want to get people's attention here. So try to open with something memorable or interesting. Potentially, this could be telling a story. Then you have the body, and this is really the bulk of your presentation. This is where you get into all of the details. Remember, you don't need to go super deep, but think about what is necessary information in order to get to the outcome that you want versus what is additional helpful context that could go somewhere else, like in an appendix or another document. And then lastly, you have the conclusion. This is where you wrap it all up and you tell everyone what you just told them. You also want to bring up any next steps at this point. One thing that you want to keep in mind as you're working through the outline of your presentation is that you have a time limit. And people have a tendency to ask questions, so you usually have less time than the overall time for the meeting. So keep that in mind. So let's talk a little bit about slide layout. One of the most important things is to keep your slides simple. I know it can be really tempting, but you want to avoid using lots of loud colors or colors that conflict. You want the slides to be easy to read. You also will want to minimize the use of transitions, unless it's something that's adding a lot of value to the meaning of the message that you're trying to explain. So here's an example of a slide that has a lot of transitions, a lot of really bright and loud colors, and a lot of different font styles as well. None of these things are actually helping to get across the meaning that you're trying to convey. Here's a better example. There's a lot less going on this slide, but that's actually okay because it's much easier and quicker to understand all of the key points. Another thing related to keeping your slides simple is that you want to have one key takeaway per slide. This is because people will start reading the slide as soon as they see it. So you want to keep all of the context focused on the key point that you want to get across. And then once you've covered everything, then you can move on to your next key point. So here's another example of a slide. Again, there's a lot going on this slide. There's a whole bunch of data, but I don't really understand its significance. There's no interpretation at all. So I'm not really sure what the takeaway or the key point of this slide is. Contrast it with this slide, which is much better. I immediately know that Team 1 scored the most points with 113 points. The slide has the same data as the previous slide. It's just been interpreted and presented in a way that makes it easier for the audience to understand. In addition to highlighting that Team 1 got the most points, I also can quickly tell that Team 4 was pretty close behind, Team 2 had half as many points as Team 1, and Team 3 didn't do very well at all. Another thing to keep in mind when you're working on your slides is you really want to limit the amount of text on each slide. Try really hard to avoid paragraphs. It's a lot of text and it's really difficult to read. You're not writing an essay here. Your audience should be able to look at the slide and understand its significance in a few seconds. Bullet points are much better at achieving this. And alternatively, you can simplify even further and use imagery to represent each bullet point, if that will add value to your message. Visuals can also be really powerful, but they can also cause a lot of confusion. So you need to be very intentional about when to use them and how. Here's a slide that has a lot of clip art and visuals going on. The problem here is I don't really understand what it all means. Visuals should enhance your message, but shouldn't be the only way that your message gets across. This slide is a much better example. There's a title that explains the key point, backed with a photo that makes it super easy to understand what the experience could actually look like.